Welcome to the Breakthrough Success Podcast, helping you achieve that breakthrough you've always been looking for in your business. And now your host, Mark Guberti.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Mark Guberti, and this is the podcast for marketers and small business owners who are looking for the breakthrough for their businesses. I am very excited about this show. For milestone episode 50 of the Breakthrough Success Podcast, we are going to talk about thriving in the new creative age and escaping that starving artist mindset with our guest, Jeff Goins. Jeff is a blogger, speaker, and the author of multiple best-selling books such as The Art of Work and his latest book, Real Artists Don't Starve. He believes that great ideas can change the world, and he creates content that allows us to tap into our inner creativity. He has trained tens of thousands of communicators to tell their stories online, and now it is my pleasure to welcome Jeff to the show.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Jeff, it's such a pleasure to have you. And when I read your book, Real Artists Don't Starve, I was absolutely amazed by the concept because some people see like starving artists as like this necessary stage you have to take to become super successful. But before we go really deep into that whole psychology, what inspired you to write your book, Real Artists Don't Starve?
Yeah, I think it was a few things. One, I was a starving artist, and then I had to become a full-time writer. I had to make money off of my writing when my wife and I decided to start a family, and we could not afford for her to quit her job and stay home to be a mom for a little while, which she wanted to do. And so I had this blog. It wasn't making any money. I heard this was something that you could do, and so I got really tenacious about finding a way to make some money off of my writing. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that I would not be an entrepreneur and a full-time writer if I weren't first a dad. It really forced me to take this a little bit more seriously and realize this isn't just about me. This is about providing for my family. So that happened, and I had some success with that. In fact, I thought I was just going to replace my wife's income with this side writing business. And in fact, in about 18 months, I replaced her income and then my income, and then we tripled our household income all through this little, writing business that I'd created. And people would tell me, that's great, you got lucky. And I kind of wondered if it was dumb luck myself. And so I'd had this experience that I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. Like, can anybody do this? Is this rare? I just didn't know. And I kept meeting two groups of people living in Nashville. I know a lot of artists, writers, musicians, even creative entrepreneurs. And those two groups of people, those people tended to fit into two groups. One were starving artists, and they would go, I'm working on this thing, I'm really passionate about it, but I'm never going to be able to make any money off of it. And it was just sort of this like foregone conclusion that if they liked it and it was creative and they were passionate about it, they weren't going to make any money off of it. And then there was this other group of people that were also doing really interesting creative work in lots of different industries, and they were killing it. And they weren't famous or celebrities, and they just like had very successful careers and businesses. And I thought, like, these two groups of people are doing practically the same thing, but the way they're doing it, the results they're getting are very, very different. And it was around this time that I discovered this story that I'd never heard before about Michelangelo. And the story is this, that in 2003, a art historian by the name of Rab Hatfield was trying to date the different scenes in the Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo had painted. And he thought, well, I'll go to his letters and see if he mentions it in his letters. And he didn't. And then he thought, well, I'll go check the bank records and see when he got his commissions and installments for the, various pieces that he, painted, because it took years to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And he could figure out, okay, that was painted around this time. And when he went to the bank records, what he saw surprised him. And in those records, he saw one bank record had several $100,000 in it. Saw another one, same deal. And like, these are not the kinds of bank records you expect a relatively young artist to have at any age. And he forgets all about the Sistine Chapel, and he goes down this road and he discovers a fortune worth over $50 million belonging to Michelangelo at the time he died. And this made Michelangelo the richest artist of the Renaissance. And at that point, he was the richest artist who had ever lived. And there were many people who followed in his footsteps. So he set a new precedent in the Renaissance for what was possible for creative people to achieve after him. And he basically broke the glass ceiling, and he made it possible for artists to be wealthy people, whereas before they were kind of, working class Joes. And so when I read this story, I thought, wow, this is what I'm seeing today. I'm seeing this new renaissance of creatives, of what I call thriving artists. And they are sort of these like mini Michelangelos following in his footsteps today. And yet there is still this story of the starving artist that many creatives and entrepreneurs and artists and writers and musicians are believing, which is just that the world will not pay you for your best work, and so it's best left as a hobby, and you shouldn't quit your day job. And as a writer, I found that not to be true. And in the book, I shared example after example of contemporary case studies as well as historical ones where the really great artists of today and of the past, 500 years, they didn't starve for their work, and they almost without fail, wholeheartedly rejected this starving artist myth and embraced a different story, which is the whole idea of the book. You get to choose the story that you believe, and whatever story you believe, whether it's the story of the starving artist or the thriving artist, that's the one that you end up living out.
I definitely agree that the story you tell yourself has a big impact on what you become. And when I read that story about Michelangelo, I did not know that he was that wealthy. And I see how certain artists who are famous today, when they died, they were struggling, and that's a story you hear from other people, and those are the stories that we tend to focus on, which is why we have this sad idea that most artists end up starving. But you could definitely be like the Michelangelo type, who is by no means a starving artist, but is actually thriving very much. And earlier you mentioned how you had this big push towards becoming successful when you became a father, and you realized that this is bigger than just me becoming successful. How can I provide for my family? And I love how you attached your success, your desire to become successful, to something bigger than yourself. But other people in a similar situation, maybe they just became a father, maybe they just started a family, and I can only imagine how tight that scheduling is. So how can we find more time to create when our schedules seem very tight?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I don't know anybody who feels like they have this abundance of time, even people who are doing their dream for a living. I thought when I became a full-time writer, I'd have more time to create, more time to write. And it still feels like I have the same amount of time. I'm a full-time writer. I could be writing all day, and yet my schedule still gets filled with all kinds of other things that are not writing. And I'm still trying to squeeze the writing into the margins of the day. And certainly, I have some more flexibility than I had before, but I don't think there's this point at which it ever you're just well, it's easy now, and I just have all this time in the world. There are always people and opportunities vying for our time, and that can pull us away from some of our most important creative work. So, we don't make more time, we find more time, as you said. And I think the best way to do that is to change your mindset about how much time you actually need to do something. Most of us procrastinate doing big things because we haven't chunked them out into small, bite-sized pieces. And so when people tell me they want to write a book, I go, don't do that. You'll never write a book if you want to write a book, because books don't get written. Words get written, sentences get written, paragraphs get written, chapters get written. It starts very small, and it has to be a daily habit that builds on itself, and it takes months and sometimes years. And then the end result is, oh, I wrote a book, not because I set out to write a book, but because I created this daily discipline that kept building with, building momentum as I went. And then eventually you go, okay, I'm going to structure this and turn this into a book. But the point is, we have these big audacious things. I'm going to run a marathon. This is not the way it works. A friend of mine, Anthony Ongaro, calls this the false first step. And the false first step is anything that we want to do, where we go like, I'm gonna do this thing. I'm gonna get into shape. And the false first step is doing something that is not the actual first step. It's a form of stalling and procrastination. So if I go, I'm going to lose weight, and I buy a gym membership, that's the false first step. I'm not being serious, because that does nothing. That's not the actual first step. It is, it's an action. There's something good about that. But the first step, the true first step, is I'm going to walk around the block today, right? Instead of being sedentary, I'm going to do something more active today than I did yesterday. That's a true first step. And the false first step of, is saying I'm going to run a marathon and announcing it on social media and feeling all good about it when you actually haven't done anything to get you any closer to that goal of finishing a marathon. And so when it comes to productivity, I think we need to get really serious about what our actual first step is. And if it is finding 10 minutes in your day, a friend of mine, this is her hack for getting her writing done. She says, I just try to write 10 minutes a day. And she wrote a novel doing this. And it's a good little mind trick, because kind of two things happen. One, it's such a ridiculously small amount of time. Like, it's pretty easy to find 10 minutes in the day, even accidentally. Like, you and I might end this interview 10 minutes early and go, oh, I've got 10 minutes a day. Normally you're like, well, I guess I'm going to go check Facebook or whatever, go to the bathroom or stare into space and go, oh, there 10 minutes went. And if you're saying all I'm going to do is like write or create or work on this idea for 10 minutes, it's such a ridiculously small amount of time. You're like, well, I guess I'll just do it now. I can't procrastinate. I'll do it first thing. And then you do it. What happens is, doing this over and over and over again, if you only have 10 minutes, you can conclude your, whatever you were doing, you can conclude your work at the end of the 10 minutes and go on to whatever your next thing was without feeling guilty. But what often happens is you keep going, right? You say, I'm going to work out for 10 minutes. I'm going to write for 10 minutes. I'm going to, try to connect with people that I don't know online, and see if I can build some, business connections this way. I'm going to do that for 10 minutes. And you get kind of lost in the project, and 15, 20, 30 minutes can go by. And so I think a really good habit is to pick a very small increment of time and find a way to do that every single day around the same time. For me, the best time to do it is either right when I get up, or it's when I sit down to do my work first thing in the morning. And I've got kids, and so there's a big block of time in my morning where I get up, I work out, then I make them breakfast, send them off to school, and then sit down to do my work. But the point is, pretty much first thing, either before they get up or after they're moving on to their activities for the day, I'm trying to get whatever it is. It could be working on a book, starting a new like creating some new program or launching a new idea. I try to do it first thing in the morning, because that's when I have a lot of energy. That's when I am least distracted. And I haven't gotten carried away with the momentum of the day of kind of reacting to emails, texts, phone calls, everybody vying for your time. And so finding a really small increment of time, scheduling it first thing in the morning or sometime consistently in the day where very little things are going to be vying for your time, and you just make it so small. You're like, well, I have to do this. Saying you're going to write for an hour every day or work out for 2.5 hours every afternoon, I mean, that's too much too soon. You can work up to those things. Pick something like 10 minutes so that it's too hard to ignore because it's so small.
Jeff, thank you for sharing those insights on how I can find more time and those mind hacks we can use. And I definitely feel it myself, where I'm just trying to squeeze in every little extra minute to do more things.
Totally.
And I mean, one thing that you said that really resonated with me is that you're a full-time writer, but you're not spending all day writing because you're doing all these different things. Like this interview, for instance, you're sharing all these great insights, but you're not writing. And I know part of the process of any artist is to do the marketing. So how can artists continue creating while doing the necessary marketing so that their work gets seen?
So one of the ideas in the book is this concept of practicing in public. Most creative people I know do not like hawking their stuff. They do not like marketing, at least in the conventional sense of the word, where you're like running around telling everybody, hey, look at me. And I argue that that's like the worst way to market your creative work anyway. The best way to do it is to practice in public. Do your work in some setting where people are likely to notice it. An example of this is how Chris Rock prepares for a comedy show. And what he does is he goes and visits a bunch of lower end comedy clubs in New Jersey. And he does this for months, every weekend, and even just random days of the week. He'll just walk into a comedy club unannounced, and he'll ask, if he can take the stage, and they let him. And he does a short little set. And for about 30 minutes, he sits on a stool, and in a very subdued way, he just reads jokes that he's written. He reads jokes off a yellow legal pad. And it is not like the big, brash, bold Chris Rock that we all know and love. He's just reading these jokes. And for the most part, he bombs, right? Because he's testing out new material. But he does this day after day, week after week, month after month. And what he's doing is if somebody laughs at a joke and he's not like being his usual crazy, exaggerated self, he goes, oh, that was a good joke. I'm going to star that. But at the end of the night, he ends up crossing out most of the jokes. And so what he's doing is he's literally practicing in front of people. And I think this is the best way to get good at something. And I also think it's the best way to get known for something. And it's really scary because obviously you've got to risk a bunch of failure, but you don't get to be Chris Rock without bombing a bunch in front of people, learning from those mistakes, getting better and better and better. And the audience, they see you bomb, yes, but they also see you get better and better and better. And they learn to trust you and believe in you and want to follow you. And I think this is happening a lot online today. Writers, you can blog, speakers, you can podcast. I see a lot of artists who are taking, like visual artists who are taking to Instagram, sharing photos and other forms of, visual art, paintings and stuff. And I have this friend who's a fine artist, and he'll just post a work in progress on his Instagram page. Hey, here's something that I'm working on. That's it. No call to action, just sharing his work. And almost every day he'll get somebody messaging him saying, hey, can I buy that? And he is selling his work without actually having to try to sell it. And I think this is the beauty of building an audience by simply sharing your work. And it's a generous act. So there's risk there. I could be doing all this work, sharing all my words, giving all this information away for free, and then nobody will want to pay me. But the reality is the more you do this, the better you get, and the more you kind of stand out from the crowd. And people want to pay people that they trust and whose work they value. And if you keep practicing in public, this is one way that you can build an audience, earn the trust of that audience, and eventually be able to sell them things.
Jeff, thank you for sharing with us how we're able to integrate the marketing side. And I really love that idea of just focusing on sharing the work that we do. Because, we share all this free value, and it gives people an idea of what they can expect when they buy some of our products and services later on. But throughout the journey that all artists face, there's a level of adversity that we all have to encounter. So how can artists fight through the inevitable adversity that they will face while they are creating their art?
Another idea in the book is this idea of stubbornness. So the book is these 12 rules of the new Renaissance. And one of the rules is that you need to harness your stubbornness. You need to practice the right kind of stubbornness. And there's a right way and a wrong way to be stubborn. Jeff Bezos said about Amazon, he said, we are stubborn on vision but flexible on details. And so the starving artist tends to be really stubborn about details, and when you're stubborn about details, you can't have a vision because you're so focused on the minutia. Whereas thriving artists tend to focus on the vision. They're stubborn on the vision. This is what I'm going to create. This is what I'm going to do. I will achieve this goal. But how they get there, the details, they're flexible on. And so in order to fight through adversity and overcome all the obstacles facing you, I think that you've got to harness that right kind of stubbornness, which is, Angela Duckworth calls it grit. And basically it's this idea that no matter what happens, I am going to stay the course. But this may not turn out the way that I thought it would. And I was doing this event last night, and somebody asked me, they said, have you ever seen somebody get like really close to a breakthrough with their art, their writing, their business, whatever, like their creative work, trying to go full time with it, and then it just didn't work? And is there kind of a difference? Is there a difference between people who almost make it and people who do? And I said, well, one difference is quitting. People who quit don't make it. But I said, I think the main difference is this. When I hear people say, if this doesn't happen, whatever it is, I'm going to replace my income, make $1 million, whatever it could be, by this time, right? By Easter, by Christmas, by Halloween, whatever. Like if this doesn't happen by this time, then I'm going to quit. Then I'm going to realize I'm not talented enough, et cetera, et cetera. And they put a timeline on it. It tends to not work out that way because there's this expectation that, and it can be an impatient one. And if they're like really concerned about achieving this by a certain time, it may not happen. It might take a little bit longer, might be a little bit harder than they thought it would be. I tend to see, no matter how hard they try, I tend to see those people fail because they're not as tenacious as the people who say, no matter what, no matter how long it takes, I'm going to find a way to make this work. And they're flexible about how they get there. And obviously, like, that could sound diluted and crazy, but those are the people who end up achieving the goals that they set, that they're willing for it to take a little bit longer, for the road to look different than they thought it would. They just know where they want to end up. And so the practical challenge here is get really, really clear on your vision. And whatever that is, I want to be a writer. It could be something vague like that. I want to start a business. But get as clear as you can on your vision. What do you want your life to look like? What do you want your career to feel like? What do you want to do? Who do you want to be? And then be very, very flexible about the details, about the way that you're going to get there. And if you do that, you will succeed.
I really love the idea of being focused on the vision and being able to modify the details as you go along that journey. And one of the things that I also really love from your book is that you said that we don't do our best work alone. And then you mentioned how some professional singers tend to collaborate with dozens of people for their albums. So with that in mind, how can we find and collaborate with the right people to produce better art?
Yeah, so I mean, one story in the book was an artist, what was it, Beyonce with her record. It's Beyonce, I think, with Lemonade. Yeah, and there was over a dozen guest writers, writers on that record that were credited for writing those songs with her and producing them in some way, and a bunch of people took to Twitter and were like mad about that when they found that. And they call her a creative genius. And I thought that was really interesting. And collaborations, especially, in the hip hop, R&B, and rap space, are big. They're just, lots of folks collaborating with each other. And I thought it was really interesting that we attach genius to a solitary effort, right? And when in reality, history's most creative geniuses did not work alone. It's proven. Lots of people have talked about this. Keith Sawyer has a great book about this called Group Genius, talking about everyone from Edison to Sigmund Freud to the Inklings and beyond. Great work in all industries does not get created by some dude, with a typewriter in a cabin in the woods on a mountaintop, or, some esoteric, genius who's, out in the middle of nowhere. Genius happens in groups. And one of my favorite stories about this is how J.R. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings. And he had written The Hobbit, and it had done pretty well, and he's working on his next book, and he was stuck. And he went out to lunch with his friend C.S. Lewis, and they were both part of a literary group called the Inklings that met every week in Oxford. They did this for years, sharing their works in progress. And so these two friends go out to lunch, and Tolkien tells Lewis, this isn't going so well. I'm really frustrated. I'm bored. I think I'm going to quit. I don't know where the story's going. And Lewis read the story and he told Tolkien, he gave him some feedback. He said, well, Tolkien, don't you know that hobbits are only interesting when they're placed in un-hobbit-like circumstances? And this blew Tolkien's mind because he hadn't thought of that and didn't realize that he was stuck in the story because the hobbits were still in the Shire. And so if you've read Lord of the Rings or seen the movies, you know that the story doesn't really pick up until they leave the Shire and go on this adventure. And because of a conversation with one friend, J.R. Tolkien picks up this book that he had been procrastinating on and avoiding because he couldn't figure this detail out. He picks it back up and he finishes it. And he writes that book. It takes him years to write it. He writes that book in the company of these friends, the Inklings. There was over a dozen of them, and they would get together every week and share their works. And Tolkien would share, pieces of the Lord of the Rings and get feedback from them. And to give you an idea of how significant this feedback was, Bilbo's original name was Bingo, which I think would have been unfortunate. And so I think we can agree that the Lord of the Rings is better for having not just one genius working on it, but really having this whole group, this collaborative circle, as Michael Farrell calls them, all giving feedback on, investing time and energy and insight into this thing that became one of the world's best-selling novels. And so, yeah, we don't do our best work alone. And if a genius, and he is a genius, like J.R. Tolkien, needs the help of his 18 friends, then how much more do we need to collaborate with other people?
Jeff, I really love that example of how, the Lord of the Rings was definitely much better because of that collaboration. And you don't really see that if you don't know the story. But
right.
It's amazing how all these little behind-the-scenes collaborations can really make a big difference on the value of the art that you provide. But speaking of the value of the art, some people, they don't really see that they are worth they don't see that art is worth it. They don't charge high prices for it. They like to charge low or just focus on free. So how can we create the belief that we are worth what we charge and to have that confidence to be able to charge higher for some of our more valuable work?
I think you just got to trick yourself. I don't think there's a way that you can go, okay, now I know that my work has value. The best way that you can believe you're worth what you charge is to charge what you're worth. And I think you have to kind of trick yourself, and you have to start selling some stuff. And the distance from 0 to 1 is exponentially greater than the distance from 1 to 2, right? So just start small and start charging something for your work so that you are setting a precedent that this is worth something. Something is way much more than nothing, even if it's a difference between $0 and $1, right? And so start there, and as you get more experience, get better, your reputation grows, you can increase your prices. But I just think the hardest part is actually charging something. Once you've done that and somebody pays you, you will begin to believe, oh my gosh, there's value here. I'm creating value, and over time, you can charge more and more for those products and services.
Jeff, thank you for sharing with us how we can get more confident in the prices that we charge, and to also, in a sense, trick ourselves to basically begin to charge for our work that we're able to produce. And one of the things with artists, I feel like this is a big focus because, that starving artist myth is sadly one of the more prevailing ideas, but Michelangelo and others prove that wrong. So how can artists make money with their art?
Right. So it starts with, charging what you're worth. And then from there, I think you have to do lots of things. You have to find what works and what doesn't work. And I'm a big proponent of building a portfolio and having multiple streams of income. And many of the world's wealthiest artists had made money off of things that we wouldn't assume they made money off of. Like, Michelangelo owned a bunch of property. Michael Jackson also owned property. One of his best investments was not in his own music career. It was in buying a big chunk of the Beatles song catalog. He owned a bunch of Beatles songs, and he bought that for $47 million. And I read recently that it's worth something like $1.5 billion today. And so just being able to identify opportunities that extend beyond what you understand to be your work, right? As a writer, as an entrepreneur, as an artist, whatever your craft is, being able to recognize ways that you can leverage these skills and different, perhaps surprising contexts is a great way to make money and make more money. And it's a great way to build a living, because now all of a sudden you don't have to just make money off this one thing. You need to sell X amount of records or Y amounts of books. And, even as a business owner, I'm not looking at like my one income stream, because that's stressful. I'm going, well, this thing's doing well, but this thing over here isn't doing as well. So we're going to focus on this thing over here. I mean, it's like a portfolio of investments. When one thing isn't doing well, you leverage something else. And this is how you build wealth. And this is also how you can build a really fulfilling career. Most of us don't want to do just one thing over and over again. We want to do a few things. And so I think today mastery is now not about being a jack of all trades, but a master of some, not one.
Jeff, thank you for sharing with us how we can make money from the work that we create. And I mean, I've been following you for a really long time, and I see some people, they view you as a role model in a sense, and I feel like viewing people as a role model is definitely very important, having that strong role model, but I feel like we shouldn't just strive to be like the role model, we should also strive to surpass the role model. So if someone came up to you and said, how can I surpass you in influence? What would you say to that person?
It's a good question. I mean, I think my roundabout way of answering that question is, if you want to be greater than somebody that you look up to, there's a decent chance that that person wants that too. Not everybody, people have egos and stuff, but the most influential leaders that I know really do want to multiply themselves. They want to make the people that are following them better than they are. And the problem with that, I think, is we get really impatient about that, and we get really proud about that too. And so I think one of the best ways to do that is through apprenticeship. So if you want to have more influence than me, which seems like that sounds like a silly thing to say, I think that really begins by becoming a student, by becoming a student of somebody else's work. Apprenticeship is this lost art that doesn't really exist in our world today, as it once did, and was kind of the way that you would start a career. You would go work in somebody's shop for years, and you would learn the skill. You would do all the grunt work, and you would do this for free in exchange for room and board and a great education. And then after 6, 7, 8 years, you'd go out and do it on your own. And if you were good enough, you would eventually be admitted to the guild and become a master yourself and be able to take on new apprentices. And so obviously that doesn't work the same way today, but we have access to unlimited resources. If you want the influence that somebody else has, the first thing that you need to do is you need to become their apprentice. And the virtual way to do that is to go, Mark, I love your podcast. Here's what it helped me do today, right? So many people want to pick your brain. They want to ask your advice. They want you to do something for them for nothing. And that's just not the way you gain the attention of an influencer. And it certainly isn't the way that you grow your own influence. And I think a really great way to do this, I mentioned this in the book, is to just email people. And if I want to get Mark's ear, I can sort of follow this little formula, which it's just a very simple email where you go, dear so-and-so, thanks for X. It helped me do Y. Now what about Z? So for example, I go, dear Mark, thanks for your podcast. I love the episode with Jeff Goins. It helped me learn how to write this email. Now I'd love to, start my own podcast. Do you have any tips or recommendations? And this is a great way to begin to build influence with influential people. And this is what I learned. Like, the hard way to get in front of a lot of people is to build your fan base, your followers, one person at a time. The easier, faster way is to find people who already have influence, gain their trust, and then they will point their audience to you. And you do this with a few people, and you can very quickly grow a large audience really off of the audiences of other people. And I think the best way to do this is to become these influencers, students, apprentices. Show them that you're actually willing to do the work that they talk about and everybody else talks about, but very few people do. If you do that over and over and over again, you will prove yourself a worthy apprentice. People want to invest in you, and you will get really good too. I mean, so I think if you want the influence that somebody else has, you need to be willing to do the work that they did, and then learn from their mistakes, and in some ways work harder and faster, but build on all of their knowledge. Like, I made a lot of mistakes that in retrospect I didn't have to make, but I had to learn them through experience. If you apprentice under somebody, you can learn from their mistakes and avoid many of the time-consuming pitfalls that they had to endure just to get to where they're at. So I do think it's easier to achieve something that somebody's achieved faster if you're actually willing to humble yourself, act like an apprentice, become a student, and do the work.
Jeff, I really love the idea of continuing to be a student. And I feel like no matter how successful anyone becomes, they just have to continue being a student in their craft and continue to learn different things by listening to podcast episodes, reading books, watching videos, whatever it takes to continue learning. And I know that you've had to learn a lot on your way to where you are now. Obviously, you're doing a lot more learning even to this day. But what is one of the big challenges that you faced on your journey?
The biggest lesson that I've learned, and I have to keep learning it, is why I'm doing this. Why I started doing this in the first place. Is it still the reason why I'm doing it today? It's kind of, for me, it's kind of easy to get lost in the wrong goals. It's about money or fame or success. And I don't think any of those things are bad, but I started this, as I mentioned, because I wanted to provide for my family. I wanted freedom, and I wanted to do something that I loved, which is writing. And there was a point a few years ago where I was spending a lot of time managing the business side of the writing business and doing very little writing. And that felt out of whack for me. And so I had to kind of realign how I was spending my time with why I was doing it. And I find that, every few months, about once a quarter, I get I wander a little bit from the reason that I'm doing this, and I've got to get back on track. And so just remembering why I'm doing it and not seeing every opportunity as something that I have to say yes to. And I think that's been a hard lesson to learn, that early on you have no opportunity, right? And so you have to create your own opportunity and fight for it. And it's a struggle. And then at a certain point, opportunities kind of come to you. And so that's like, you're not used to that. And so you obviously say yes to them because it sounds like a good idea. But then the opportunities can literally pull you away from the work that you did to get those opportunities in the first place. So in my case, it might be, being invited to do a bunch of podcasts or interviews or speaking gigs or whatever, and or talking about writing, and then I find myself doing very little writing because I'm saying yes to all these invitations to talk about it. And I realize I'm talking about the thing that I'm no longer doing. And if I stop doing this long enough, I won't have anything to talk about. And so for me, it's kind of finding that balance and remembering why I'm doing what I'm doing and not straying too far from it.
I really find that interesting, how you get all these opportunities, but you have to turn some of them down because they're taking away from what you truly want to do. And I love how you were able to provide that insight, because a lot of people, they're searching for opportunity now, but you get to a point where you have to say no to them, which it's hard in some cases to turn down really good opportunities, but you have to, for the sake of continuing your own work.
Yeah, I think so. And it's not just that, Mark. It's also like I'm not on this podcast because I'm good at being on podcasts. Like, hopefully I'm on this podcast because I'm good at writing books. And if I just do a bunch of podcasts and I stop writing books, the opportunities will stop coming. And I realize that, like, I like these opportunities. I want to promote my work. I want to talk about it. It's an honor. I don't want to not do this. But if I do this in excess, I actually destroy my own credibility. And I think that's something that we don't think about. Like, if you are just talking about the work, you're not doing the work, and you will eventually, like, those opportunities where people want you to talk about the work, those will stop because, you're not actually doing what you're talking about.
That's an interesting view of how to balance the opportunities and balance the work so that you're able to continue doing the work, which leads into more and also even better opportunities than what you've been getting in the past. And I mean, you've shared all these really great insights within your book, Real Artists Don't Starve. And I mean, you're going to get all these different opportunities. But going back to the idea of books, as the natural bookworm that I am, I'm wondering if there are 3 books you can think of that would be great books for me and, more importantly, breakthrough success listeners to read through.
Yeah, great question. I'm going to give you kind of like 3, I don't know, maybe unusual books, but I like unusual books. One great book that I read that was very influential on me and my understanding of art and money and business was this book called Make Art, Make Money. And the author's name is Elizabeth Hyde Stevens, I think is her name. Make Art, Make Money. And what it is it's it's like a business biography of Jim Henson's career. And it talks about how he balanced the art and business of what he did, with creating the Muppets. And it's really fascinating and lots of great stories. It talks about how he got started doing commercials and how he was very business minded, but he was also very creative, and how those lived in tension, and why he got started doing commercials. But then when he did Sesame Street, it was a non-commercial thing. He didn't want to have commercials. That's why every episode was brought to you by a letter. So yeah, it's a really good book. I love biographies. Since we're talking about Real Artists Don't Starve, we talked about Michelangelo. A great biography that's a fun read is a book called The Agony and the Ecstasy by Irving Stone, which is a novelized biography. It's very accurate, but it's basically it's written as a novel, and the only thing that is made up essentially is the dialogue, because we don't know what Michelangelo said during his lifetime for the most part, but everything else is entirely factual. And that's a great book. It's called The Agony and the Ecstasy by Irving Stone. And I just I enjoy a good novel. I recently read The Godfather by Mario Puzo. I'd never read that, and that was really good. Another great book on creativity, if you're into that, is The Creative Habit by Twyla Tharp, who's one of the world's leading dancers and choreographers. And she talks about, it's a very practical book on how to be more creative, and that's called The Creative Habit. So those are 4 books for you, Mark. I did a bonus one.
Jeff, thank you for sharing with us all those great book recommendations. And I'm sure Breakthrough Success listeners are going to go through some of those books, or maybe they've read some of those books in the past. But throughout this interview, I've asked you a lot of questions, and I have one more question for you before we enter that plug stage where I just let you share with some of the things you're working on. But what is one question that you believe we need to be asking ourselves more often?
I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is this what I really want? And part of that question is another question, which is this who I really am? This is really important to me, this idea of authenticity and doing genuine, original, important work. I don't just want to be successful. I want to do interesting work that matters. And so, when I'm chasing something, when I'm stressed out about something, I try to ask the question, is this what I really want? Or am I feeling some angst because I'm pursuing something that's not really who I am? it doesn't fit my personality or my desires or goals in life. And so I think we chase these things that we're told we want. We're told will make us happy or successful or look cool to our friends. And then we do these things and we, sometimes make ourselves miserable doing it because it's not really what we want or who we want to be. And so I just think we need to be really, really honest about that question.
Jeff, thank you for sharing with us that one question that we should be asking ourselves more often, and for providing all of your great insights throughout this interview. And before we go, I'd love to give you that plug that I promised earlier. So just tell us, what are some of the things you're working on and where can we find you on the web?
Yeah, so you can find me at my blog, goinswriter.com. That's like coins with a G, Goins writer.com. If you're interested in writing, blogging, growing an online audience, I talk about all that on the blog. You can sign up for the newsletter and get a free ebook about how to build your online audience there as well. And check out the book, Real Artists Don't Starve. It's available on Amazon, wherever fine books are sold. It's on Audible if you're an audiobook listener, as I am. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, all those places. That's all on my blog at goinswriter.com. That's the best place to connect with me.
Jeff, thank you for sharing some of the things that you're working on and for sharing all these great insights. It was a pleasure to have you on the Breakthrough Success podcast.
Thanks, Mark. The pleasure is all mine.
Breakthrough Success listeners, thank you for taking the time to listen to episode 50 of the podcast. And if you want the show notes to this episode, you can head over to markgabberty.com/E50 for those. And just to give you an idea of what I'm planning on doing, since this is the 50th episode of the Breakthrough Success podcast, the long-term goal is to turn this into a daily podcast by the end of the year. I'm still experimenting with this and lining up my schedule so that I'm able to interview over 30 people every single month, as I've been able to do for my Content Marketing Success Summit and my Productivity Virtual Summit. So you're going to be getting a lot more interviews containing this type of intense value that is really going to help you find the breakthrough for your business. This is Mark Gabberty, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode and the others of the Breakthrough Success podcast.
To never miss an episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on whatever player you are using. If you are a regular listener and haven't done so already, I would greatly appreciate it if you could give this podcast a review or a rating. Two ways you could do this are through markgabberty.com/iTunes or markgabberty.com/Stitcher. That ends this episode. Don't forget, dream big, achieve greatness, and unlock your potential today.
Want me to mention you in a future episode? All you have to do is leave a quick review for my podcast on iTunes and email me, mark@markgabberty.com. I'll then mention you and your website in a future episode. You can leave that review by heading over to markgabberty.com/iTunes.
This podcast is a production done by Mark Gabberty. For more insights, head on over to markgabberty.com.